On the wide, windswept plains of Arkansas, where the tall grass hissed like the sea, stood a lonely Victorian farmhouse. Locals called it Widow's Hill. Its paint had long turned the color of weathered bone, and its porch sagged as though the earth itself were tired of holding it up. Only one chimney ever smoked there now, and always on Sundays, sending a sweet scent of jasmine and wild berries drifting across the fields. People said the widow who lived there brewed tea for ghosts. Others swore it was sorrow she boiled in that kettle. Her name was Eliza Morrow, and since the fire that had taken her husband and young son 7 years earlier, she had lived alone with her grief and her teapot. At the general store down in Flat River Crossing, talk of Eliza was a favorite pastime. "Another tea gathering this Sunday," drawled Mrs. Cranford, thumbing through a sack of flour. "Poor woman's cracked," muttered Mr. Dalton, the storekeeper. "Still talks to her dead." But the ranch hand by the stove leaned forward. "Funny thing, though. Folks who drink her tea always look peaceful, too peaceful. Then they stop coming to town altogether." A shiver ran through the room. Everyone wanted to gossip, but no one wanted to finish the thought hanging in the air. That peace might mean something worse. That Friday morning, Annie Cole, the new 23-year-old schoolteacher, found a cream-colored envelope beneath her door. In graceful handwriting, it read, "Mrs. Eliza Morrow cordially invites Miss Annie Cole for afternoon tea, Sunday, 3 o'clock." Annie traced the ink with her thumb. She'd heard the stories, of course, but loneliness outweighed superstition. A week of dusty classrooms and silent evenings had made her hungry for company, any company. She decided she would go. The path up Widow's Hill wound between sun-bleached fences and silent cottonwood trees. When Annie reached the porch, the door opened before she could knock. Eliza Morrow stood framed in the light. Tall, silver-haired, eyes the pale gray of rain clouds. "Welcome, Miss Cole," she said, in a voice soft as linen. "Come warm yourself." The parlor glowed amber. 3 guests already sat with steaming cups, their faces strangely serene. A clock ticked, deliberate as a heartbeat. Eliza's smile trembled. "My husband used to say, 'Tea joins hearts better than words.' I still pour it for him." Eliza served the tea in delicate blue-flowered cups. The fragrance wrapped Annie like a memory. Sweet, earthy, touched with something she couldn't name. "It's beautiful," Annie whispered. "It's called moonbloom," said Eliza. "The petals open only beneath starlight." Annie sipped. Warmth spread through her chest, quieting every restless thought. For the first time since she'd left home, she felt safe. Across the table, the other guests smiled faintly, eyes distant, as if listening to music only they could hear. As the afternoon stretched on, conversation faded to murmurs. One by one, the guests rose politely, excused themselves, and stepped into the adjoining parlor. Minutes passed. No laughter, no farewells. Curiosity pricked at Annie. She pushed the door slightly open and froze. Inside, the guests sat motionless in velvet chairs, cups balanced loosely in their hands, faces peaceful and still. They looked asleep. But something about the stillness felt final. Annie gasped. The cup slipped from her grasp and shattered. Eliza was suddenly beside her, calm and kind. "They're not gone," she said gently. "They're only resting." "Resting?" Annie's voice shook. "What did you do to them?" Eliza's eyes glistened. "I gave them what they asked for, peace. The world offered them pain. My tea offered release." "That's death," Annie cried. "It's mercy," Eliza whispered. "They chose it. I merely poured the cup." On the back porch, the 2 women watched the sunset bleed across the plains. Eliza spoke softly, almost to herself. There was a soldier who could not sleep for the faces he'd seen, a mother who buried her babe and begged God for silence, a farmer who could no longer feed his family. Each came to me broken. I gave them rest. Annie's heart twisted. But you're playing God. Eliza shook her head. No, child. God turned his face away. I only offered a hand in the dark. The wind carried the scent of jasmine through the dusk, and neither woman spoke again. Back in town that night, a letter waited on Annie's table, stamped with the county seal. Miss Cole, be warned. Widow Morrow is under suspicion. Several visitors to her teas have vanished. Stay clear of the hill. Sheriff Albert Keene. Annie sat motionless, vanished. She could still see their peaceful faces, hear Eliza's calm words. Was it murder? Or was it compassion that the world refused to understand? She blew out her lamp, but sleep would not come. Near dawn, she finally drifted into a dream steeped in the scent of moonbloom. She was again in Eliza's parlor. The same guests surrounded her, smiling with a quiet joy that no living person ever wore. Then Eliza appeared, radiant and young, setting a cup before her. One day, Annie, she murmured, you'll see that rest can be mercy too. Annie looked down. The tea shimmered like liquid starlight. In its surface, she saw her own reflection, eyes filled not with fear but understanding. She woke with tears on her cheeks and whispered into the gray light, I think I understand, Mrs. Morrow. I just don't know if the world ever will. A week passed. Annie couldn't concentrate at school. Her lessons blurred. The faces of her students reminded her of the still faces in Eliza's parlor, peaceful, weightless, gone. On Sunday morning, she made her choice. She packed a loaf of bread, a shawl, and started the familiar climb up the hill. The path felt heavier now, as though the earth itself resisted her steps. Eliza was in the garden, pruning pale flowers that glowed faintly even under the sun. When she saw Annie, her lips curved into a sad smile. I knew you'd come back, she said. I had to, Annie whispered. I can't stop thinking about what you said, about mercy. Eliza nodded slowly. Mercy is a dangerous kindness, my dear. The world often punishes it. They stood in silence, surrounded by the hum of bees and the faint perfume of jasmine that seemed eternal, even in grief. Eliza led Annie through the garden. The air grew still, sacred somehow. White blossoms, moonbloom, swayed gently over rows of iron crosses. Beneath each one was a carved wooden plaque, simple and tender. Thomas, father and soldier. Clara, mother of one. James, the farmer. Annie's breath caught. They're graves? Eliza nodded. They wanted to be here, where the wind never stopped singing. Their souls rest where kindness met its end. Annie knelt and touched the soil. It was warm, not from the sun, but from something deeper. You cared for them, she murmured. I loved them, Eliza corrected softly, when no one else would. A tear slipped down Annie's cheek. She understood now why the widow's eyes always looked both alive and broken. They held too many farewells. 2 days later, a dust cloud rose from the road below the hill, a sheriff's wagon. Annie watched from the porch as Sheriff Albert Keene stepped out, hat low, expression grim. Mrs. Morrow, he said, we've had reports. People disappear after coming here. You know I can't ignore that. Eliza didn't flinch. She invited him in. You've come for answers then. Have some tea first. The kind that soothes, not the kind that ends. The sheriff hesitated but followed her in. The house was warm, quiet, peaceful. He looked around and saw the empty chairs, the porcelain cups, the portraits of her husband and son still hanging above the mantel. Mrs. Morrow, he said finally, you understand the gravity of this. She smiled faintly. Gravity, Sheriff, is what brings every soul to rest. Annie arrived midway through their conversation. She stood by the door, heart pounding. She hasn't killed anyone, Annie said firmly. They wanted peace. She didn't force them. The sheriff turned to her. Miss Cole, peace or not, helping someone die is still against the law. A good heart doesn't make a crime vanish. Eliza's hands trembled as she poured the tea. Perhaps, she said softly, the law was written by men who never lost everything. The sheriff sighed. Ma'am, if I find proof of wrongdoing, I'll have to take you in. Eliza looked up, eyes shining with quiet defiance. Then let me pour one last cup, for myself. That night, under a sky swollen with stars, Eliza gathered every jar of moonbloom petals from her shelves. Annie helped her carry them to the edge of the garden. Together, they lit the fire. The flames rose, devouring the jars, filling the night with the bittersweet fragrance of jasmine and smoke. Eliza watched, tears glistening. This scent used to comfort me, she said. Now it only reminds me that I took away the pain, but also the chance of healing. Annie grasped her trembling hands. You can still heal by living. Eliza smiled sadly. Child, I've lived my story. Yours is just beginning. Promise me something. Promise you'll teach others to listen before they judge. I promise, Annie whispered. A month later, word spread that the widow was hosting one final tea, this time open to the entire town. The townsfolk came hesitantly. Farmers, widows, teachers, even Sheriff Keene. They filled her parlor, uneasy but curious. Eliza stood at the head of the table, her black shawl replaced by a soft gray one. Today's tea, she said, is not for sleep, but for remembrance. As they sipped, laughter slowly replaced silence. People shared stories of lost loved ones, of hardships and small mercies. For the first time, Widow Morrow's house echoed with life, not whispers of the dead. Annie watched her mentor move among the guests, smiling tenderly, touching shoulders, offering comfort without a single drop of moonbloom. When the sun dipped behind the hills, the townsfolk lingered. No one wanted to leave. That evening, after the guests had gone, Eliza sat by the window overlooking the plains. The last light of sunset painted her silver hair in gold. Annie approached quietly. You changed them today, she said. You changed me. Eliza turned her gaze toward the horizon. Maybe that's what I was meant to do all along. Not to end pain, but to remind the living that compassion doesn't need permission. She reached into her shawl and handed Annie a sealed envelope. For when I'm gone. Don't open it until the house is quiet again. Annie's throat tightened. You're not going anywhere. Eliza smiled faintly. Everyone goes somewhere, child. The trick is to leave gentleness behind. The next morning, Annie climbed the hill again to check on Eliza. The door was slightly ajar. Inside, the house smelled of lavender and old wood. Eliza sat in her favorite chair by the window, her hands folded, a cup of ordinary jasmine tea beside her. The fire had gone out, the light soft and golden. Annie rushed forward, but she knew before she touched her, the widow had gone. Not with moonbloom, not with pain, just sleep. The kind born of peace earned at last. Annie knelt, weeping softly, her hand on the widow's shoulder. Outside, the wind moved through the grass, and it almost sounded like a lullaby. With trembling fingers, Annie opened the sealed envelope. Inside was a letter written in Eliza's graceful script. My dear Annie, if you are reading this, my tea is cold and my story complete. Do not mourn me. I have only joined those who found rest before me. Remember, compassion often breaks the rules of men, but never the laws of the soul. When the world condemns kindness, defend it anyway. Keep the garden alive. Let its blossoms remind the living to tend to one another's pain before despair blooms in its place. Eliza Morrow. Annie pressed the letter to her heart. Tears fell silently. But they were not only of grief, they were of gratitude. Years passed. The hill no longer frightened travelers. The Morrow House became a school for children and a refuge for weary souls. Annie tended the garden faithfully. Moonblooms still grew there, but she never brewed them into tea again. Every spring she invited the townsfolk for tea made of jasmine, honey, and wild herbs. They would sit beneath the oaks and tell stories of love, loss, and forgiveness. Children called it the Garden of Mercy. Adults called it the Widow's Blessing. When visitors asked Annie about the old rumors, about the tea that made guests sleep forever, she would smile softly and say, "She didn't kill them. She set them free." The world wasn't ready to understand mercy then, but maybe now we are. And as the wind whispered across the plains, carrying the scent of jasmine once more, it almost sounded like Eliza's laughter, gentle, eternal, and at peace.